The Dwarf of the Drachenfels. Narrated by Tori. Chapter 1. A Prudent Match. A certain Hofrith, renowned in his youth for his long-winded orations about nothing, but which he and the loving friends who diurnally dined at his expense held to be in the genuine Demosthenic vein, became old, which was perfectly in the course of nature, and poor, which was solely the result of his stupidity in feasting a herd of parasites. And the consequences were that he not only lost his hair, but his friends. His baldness he covered with a wig, the retreat of his friends with maledictions. Distress and desertion at length operated so strongly on his mental imbecility that although he did not exactly become insane, his eccentricity nearly bordered upon it, and certainly turned his wig. Yes, the unfortunate Hofrith persisted to the day of his death in wearing the hind part of his artificial peruke before, the little ribbon-bound tail projecting from his forehead like the horn of the fabled unicorn, tickling all beholders to laughter. Running counter to the prevailing custom, as this whim assuredly did, there was humor in it, and we are constrained at least to admire the poor fellow's independence and his utter contempt of the dictum of despotic fashion. There was originality in it, and had he been a man of wealth and influence, why, half the imitative puppies within the atmosphere of his eccentric orbit would have been emulously running tail foremost in the race of notoriety. Now, although we are one of those dollarless authors who are too poor to lend, we possess that gracious condescension which is ever prompt to borrow. We therefore intend to cast, compose, and fashion our veritable story after the precise manner of the Hofrith's wig, commencing instead of concluding with a marriage, as is the wanton custom of most writers, and in fine, turn the hind part before. Know then, curious reader, that as far back as the 16th century there flourished a youth glorying in the euphonious name of Karl Moritz von Pludermann. As early as the age of 18 he distinguished himself by a luminous essay in quarto upon the saltatory locomotion of the flea. At 25 he began his famous entomological museum, and so industriously did he labor that the price of pins and corks rose considerably in the market. At 30 he was so profound a metaphysician that he completely soared above the comprehension of all his competitors. His delicate, fine-spun theories proved so many spider-webs to all the summer flies who rashly rushed into an argument with him, and in which his poor, powerless antagonists became inextricably entangled. In his taciturnity, he was a perfect Harpocrates, and notwithstanding some of his enemies would sneeringly quote the maxim, "Silence is either a mark of wisdom or stupidity." His only reply was a smile so full of meaning that none of them could grapple with it. In fine, von Pludermann was a philosopher. Among numerous other crotchets which frisked in the heated atmosphere of his brain, as plentifully as crickets in a bakehouse, was an unalterable resolution that he would not fall in love before the mature age of 40. Now whether he ever did tumble head over ears into that delectable mixture of gall and honey, it is impossible at this distant period to determine, but certain it is that he married and bore to his paternal castle the beautiful Kunigunda von Stiffenzaud. Her tresses were flaxen, her oculars sky blue, and her lips and cheeks rosy as summer's morn. In figure she was faultless as a piece of sculpture, and in disposition as cold. She was in truth formed in every particular for the spouse of such a philosopher. She fitted his humor without a wrinkle, and was as perfect as if the Baron had bespoken her. Chapter 2. A Birth. "Finis coronat opus!" exclaimed a merry young student of Göttingen, when, having toiled to the pinnacle of a pretty mountain, he seated himself on its bold summit. Echoing this classical quotation, the erudite Baron von Pludermann threw away his indefatigable goose-quill, exhibiting an excitement as extraordinary in him as it would have been to have seen a cow or any other dull, ruminating animal suddenly take to its heels and leap over a quick-set hedge. He had just completed his grand metaphysical work upon cause and effect, which his extensive mind had been elaborating for the past 12 months, during which period he was as absorbed and almost as invisible as a glass of wine in a sponge, and as wrapped up in his fine-spun fancies as the worm in its silken ball. He had indeed almost forgotten that he was anything more than homo simplex, an individual. As for the amiable Kunigunda, the current of her equable temper was unruffled by his neglect, and she placidly pursued her avocations of knitting and embroidery, perfectly happy in the stagnant tranquility of her destiny. She was too indolent even to utter a murmur, and in truth experienced no loss in the absence of her marital metaphysician, for even in her company he was usually absent, and therefore she never found herself more alone at one time than another. Happy mortals, or rather, what two blessed vegetables were they? "'Tis done!" exclaimed von Pludermann. "And now go forth, thou perfection, thou fructification of mental maturity, go forth and slake the thirst of science, go forth, thou luminous phrenoprogeny, and be a lantern to the footsteps of those erring mortals who stumble in the dark and miry ways of ignorance. Go!" A sudden and most unusual commotion within the walls of Schloss Pludermann arrested the Baron's egotistico soliloquio eulogium. His speech was snapped in twain like a brittle fresh carrot in the hands of a hungry ploughboy. An old woman, whose physiognomy resembled a clay puddle under the influence of a sharp frost, so yellow and so wrinkled was it, bustled into the Baron's sanctum, and with an importance suited to the occasion informed him that a son was just born. The sudden announcement of his paternity recalled to his tender and sagacious mind that he had a wife, and oblivious for the nonsense of cause and effect, he followed the matron to the chamber of Kunigunda. Chapter 3. Ditto. The vassals of Schloss Pludermann were all assembled in the hall, discussing in hopeful whispers the probability of a festival to celebrate the arrival of the young stranger. The sportive dance and song of revelry, the plenteous board and flowing cup were already seen in the delusive perspective of anticipation. "Saddle my horse on the instant," exclaimed the Baron, rushing wildly into the midst of the levee, his pale countenance dismally distorted by his disordered mind. Alas! His fierce look crushed all their fresh green hopes as instantaneously and effectually as the iron-shod hoof of a courser would a cluster of mushrooms. Away scuttled the vassals, and in the twinkling of an eye the charger was at the castle gate. With a plumeless cap drawn over his brow, and enveloped in a large cloak, the renowned von Pludermann, silent, sombre, sad, and unattended, galloped away, and both man and horse were speedily swallowed up in the grim obscurity of the starless night. But we are insensibly growing poetical. Excited by the extraordinary interest of this our history, we have mistaken the winged Pegasus for our gently ambling prose donkey. We dismount, and now come hither, Neddy, and bray forth like an asinine beauty as thou art, a most melodious bass to the tenor of our tale. "Woe, woe!" exclaimed the matron of the petrified servitors. "The infant is gone." "Dead," chorused the whole group. "And my lady is desperate ill," continued the old woman. "And the Baron has gone for a leech, and pray, some of ye bring me a flask of wine, or I shall never have spirits to get through this miserable night." "He really is a beautiful boy," said the Baroness Kunigunda von Pludermann, indolently gazing upon an infant in the nurse's arms. "Yes, there is intellect in that forehead," observed the philosopher, her husband. "He shall not want for education, and may he one day do honor to the house of von Pludermann." This conversation took place just 7 years after the occurrence we have attempted to describe, Kunigunda having presented the Baron with a son. A baby, however, was too uninteresting an object to a man of his enormous mental caliber, and he left the bantling to the care of the women, The young Baron had actually attained his 7th year before the old Baron began to take notice, and then he certainly did set about the task of developing his plastic mind in good earnest. And the boy, who really possessed the most promising genius, bade fair to fulfill his father's hope of making him a profound scholar, had not his idleness continually checked his progression. Alack, how frequently are genius and idleness linked together, and like a couple of pup-pointers, pull different ways. Chapter 4. A Tutor. Ernest, so was the youthful Baron named, pursued his studies, or rather, allowed his studies to pursue him, under the sway and direction of the renowned Pluderman, until he attained his 15th year, when the learned Baron discovered that his hopeful son took too much of his time, and too little of his metaphysical doses. For while he astonished his father by the shrewdness of his questions, he more frequently failed in pleasing him by his answers. In fact, Ernest was of too vivacious a disposition to suit the cold, plodding temperament of his philosophical sire, or the indolent inactivity of his pretty mother. His disposition was a riddle which the Baron found he could not solve, and so resolved to give it up. When he thought he was extracting the square root, Master Ernest was assisting the gardener in digging up the turnips, and when he should have been studying the use of the globes, he found the untoward boy playing at football. But notwithstanding all these irregularities, the youth possessed great ability, and had managed to pick up a considerable share of useful knowledge. "Ernest," said von Pluderman one day, "I have selected for you a tutor who will henceforth superintend your mental culture, for I find the care of your education trenches too much upon my studies, and that I am selfishly sacrificing those talents to one, which the whole world is entitled to enjoy." This was really a benevolent view of the case, induced perhaps by gratitude to that world which had uncomplainingly endured his neglect, and which the Baron's envious contemporaries would probably have accounted for by asserting that it never experienced either loss or inconvenience from his silence. Ernest received his intimation with a thoughtful gravity, which was highly gratifying to the Baron. The fact is that his active mind was already busily hatching plans and schemes for the subjugation of the expected tutor to his will and pleasure. In the afternoon of the following day, Ernest had just returned from the chase of the wild boar which abounded in the forest in the neighborhood of Schloss Pluderman, when he was summoned to the Baron's study. No sooner had he entered the somber apartment than he was startled by the apparition of a dwarf, who was standing cap in hand beside his patron's table. He was plainly dressed, for indeed all ornament would have been thrown away upon such an ungainly figure. His chest was expansive, his arms so disproportionately long that the cap he dangled in his hand reached his ankle. His face was colorless, and its pallid complexion rendered still more striking by the contrast with the dark elf looks that twined about his marble brow and coiled like snakes about his broad shoulders, while his thick mustachios, of the same ebon hue, aided the unpleasing effect. The Baron laconically introduced them, and formally consigned Ernest to the charge of his strange tutor. If Ernest was surprised at the personal appearance of the dwarf, he was no less so at his polished manners and deportment, so superior to anything he had ever witnessed within the confines of Schloss Pluderman. And when he spoke, a voice so sweet and musical saluted his ears that he was delighted. His varied learning, too, and the attractive way in which he imparted it soon won the attention of his pupil. In fact, Friedrich Clausel was like a good pocket telescope. You had but to draw him out to discover his value. Even the ignorant vassals, who were at first affrighted at his appearance, especially the female portion, who are invariably ardent admirers of beauty, whether in men or animals, were speedily convinced of his superiority, and ceased to think him ugly. So great is the power of suavity, that sweet oil which greaseth the wheels of society, that saponaceous quality which washes and beautifies the face of ugliness itself, that fabled diamond in the toad's head, that etc. Ernest found his tutor as ready to join in his sports as to assist him in his studies, and Fritz, so he familiarly called the dwarf, became his friend and companion. He insisted upon introducing him to the Baroness, and one day abruptly entered her apartment leading in the dwarf. The indolent beauty no sooner cast her languid blue eyes upon the uncouth object so suddenly presented to her eyes than she let fall her eternal knitting needles, and was struck dumb with surprise. A single glance was sufficient to convince the intelligent Fritz of her disgust and horror. "Madam," said he, in a tone of tender plaintiveness that penetrated her soft heart like a needle of the purest gold, "I see that I have the misfortune to displease you. I have not willingly thrust myself into your presence, and in future I will sedulously avoid offending your sight by my deformity. But when nature is so lavish of her personal gifts to some," and the dwarf looked so expressively at the Baroness that the illusion could not be mistaken, at least by a vain woman, "she must of necessity play the niggard in her distribution towards others. And you, madam, who possess so bountiful a share of her favors, should not in justice despise those whom you have deprived of their rightful portion." This was a home thrust, a lunge that could not be parried, and vanity incontinently yielded to the compliment. And although Fritz never again intruded, he was almost daily invited to her presence, for the languid dame found entertainment without fatigue in his delightful conversation, which he had the enviable art of suiting to every capacity. Chapter 5. A Sudden Departure. The Herr Friedrich Clausel, or as he was popularly called by the vulgar villagers in the vicinity, the dwarf of the Drachenfels, and by whom he was regarded, notwithstanding his diminutive stature, as nothing short of a sorcerer, had been resident at Schloss Plüdemann nearly 7 years, when the Baron was suddenly confined to his chamber by a serious sickness. The fact is, the great philosopher had dedicated too much of his time to the devotion of discovery, without a due regard to his health. For the last 3 years he had grown gradually thinner, and at last became almost invisible. He had been occupied upon elaboration of an entirely new and original theory upon the earth's motion, and contracted an incurable dyspepsy. And alas, for science, the work that was intended to have immortalized him proved his death. His widow would no doubt have sincerely wept his loss, but her happy destiny spared her the fatigue of sorrowing by transplanting her to the plains of Elysium 2 years before this melancholy occurrence, which proved a material saving in the article of mourning. Ernest, too, at this juncture, was absent from Schloss Plüdemann, having prevailed upon the Baron to permit him to pay a short visit to some young noblemen in the gay, profligate Vienna. Fritz alone was his nurse and friend and best physician, but not even his cunning could counteract his complaint. The Baron would scarcely permit him to quit his sight, and long and deep and mysterious were the communications he then made, the effects of which were visible to all in the agitated and expressive countenance of the dwarf. Finding his patron's life drawing to a close, he dispatched a trusty messenger in all haste to summon the instant attendance of Ernest. The youth came, but the old man had already departed. But we will draw a veil over the melancholy details. Suffice it, that death had put his extinguisher upon one of the brightest lights of the age. The only consolatory thought was, that as he reached 80 years and 10, it might reasonably be supposed that he was just flickering in the socket, and in the course of all sublunary things he must have gone out, if not put out. Chapter 6. Friendship.
"My dear Ernest," said the dwarf, "I must now leave you. You are grown beyond the reach of my control."
"I deserve this blow," said Ernest. "I know my dissipation and extravagance have disgusted my best, my only friend. But if I err so much even while I enjoy the advantage of your advice, what will become of me if you desert me? You are my regulator, the very weight to the clock. And if you take yourself off, whir, whir go the wheels, and lo, in the twinkling of an eye I'm wound up." The dwarf smiled. "Fritz, dear Fritz," exclaimed the young baron earnestly, for he really entertained the sincerest affection for his extraordinary tutor. "You will not leave me. Nay, I require all your aid, for I am involved in difficulties the most imminent. In the vortex of pleasure in that depraved capital, I was whirled about until I lost my senses. I have been surrounded by sharpers, deep, designing plunderers, to whom I have lost and owe vast debts of honor."
"Honor,"
cried the dwarf.
"How do men abuse that word?"
"And without your aid and assistance," continued Ernest, "I shall be lost, for I am like a frail bark tossed by the tempestuous winds and at the mercy of the waves. I am surrounded by rocks."
"Fear not," said Fritz. "I will take the helm and steer you clear of all. I possess not only the will, but the power. I have tested your friendship and found you true. Fear nothing from these harpies who are your creditors."
"I have but one," replied the contrite Ernest, "Count Hermann von Ildesheim, and I have no doubt he will soon be here to claim his bond." His suspicions were soon verified, for on the same day the Count von Ildesheim was formally announced. Ernest, ill in mind and body, had retired to his chamber, where Fritz was exerting his eloquence to calm his perturbation. The Count was already mounting the grand staircase when he was suddenly arrested by the startling figure of the dwarf, who confronted the gambler, pistol in hand. "What is the meaning of this outrage?" demanded the Count.
"Advance another step," replied Fritz, "and you are a dead man. I know you most, noble Count. Retire."
"Am I to be robbed?" cried Ildesheim.
"No, nor am I, or Ernest," replied Fritz menacingly. "Retire. My next reply shall be a bullet."
The discomfited gambler, like an acute and clever man, as he was, wisely withdrew. Chapter 7. The Denouement. Count Hermann lost no time in summoning the Baron Ernest von Pludemann before the proper tribunal for the liquidation of his bond. The court was crowded to excess. The president had already taken his seat, and the officer called upon Ernest, in the emperor's name, to appear, when a shout of irreverent laughter rang through the court, and the next moment the dwarf confronted the president. Calmly mounting one of the benches, he addressed the court.
"My lord," said he, "I appear before you on behalf of Baron Ernest von Pludemann. In replication, I humbly contend, firstly, that the demand of the appellant is untenable in law, being for a debt incurred at gambling. Secondly, that this self-styled Count Hermann von Ildesheim is an impostor, an escaped convict, whose real name is Johann Mücke."
"My lord," cried the appellant, growing pale, "I must insist upon knowing by what authority this man takes upon himself to defend the creditor. His slanderous language he shall answer in another place."
"This document," replied the dwarf, handing a parchment to the president, "I think will satisfy the court. It is the will of the late Baron Karl Moritz von Pludemann, by which I am constituted the sole guardian of Ernest, and moreover declared to be his firstborn son and heir, Baron Paul von Pludermann.
A buzz of amazement followed this announcement, but nevertheless it was perfectly true. Shocked by the deformity of the infant, the old baron had instantly conveyed him from Schloss Pludermann. But although concealing his birth, he had spared no cost in his education, and subsequently his gentle disposition, his great attainments, and brotherly love to Ernest had induced the old baron, at the point of death, to impart to him the secret of his birth, to do him ample justice. The Count Hermann von Ildesheim, alias Johann Mirka, endeavored to effect his escape, but the quick eye of his stern accuser was upon him, and in a moment he found himself in the iron grasp of the Dwarf of the Drachenfels.